Hello and welcome to this TARSA Thursday webinar. My name is Roger Wilkinson. I am the Digital Publications Editor of TARSA. I would like to introduce to you today Erik Aslaksen, and Erik is going to talk about his paper, and the paper is called Society as an Information Processing System. Before I do, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this land. I recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and today I am talking to you from Gimoy Wallabara Yidinji country.
All right, thank you, Roger. And hello, everyone, both old friends and new acquaintances. I am located on Sydney's northern beaches, and I pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land, the Gayamigal people of the Eora Nation. I am pleased to have this opportunity to explain and discuss what I have been working on in recent years, and that is the evolution of society. But first, a word regarding my background. I am not a sociologist. I am an engineer and physicist and have spent my 50-year career in industry in roles ranging from basic research to corporate management. That is important as this background is reflected in the view of society and its evolution that I shall present to you in this talk. And it is a view that probably differs significantly from what you are used to, and one that does not seem to fit easily into any of the accepted areas of social theory. However, as I am basically an optimist, I hope that one or the other of you might want to look further into this particular approach and perhaps pursue further research into one of the many issues it raises. Now, in the time available and allowing for what I hope will be a lively Q&A period, I can only present a small part of what I have developed over the last 5 years or so. But as that is all based on a few general ideas or assertions, I thought that I would present these and some of their implications and see if they make sense to you. And perhaps you can help me define these ideas more sharply. The first idea requires a bit of fantasy and lateral thinking, but if you bear with me, you will soon see where it leads. Society has evolved from groups of cave dwellers to our present nation states, and increasingly, albeit slowly and with several hiccups, towards a world society of some form. So the first idea is that this evolution of society can be seen as the current stage of a general process of evolution. A process consisting of a sequence of quite different stages, but stages that have some characteristics in common. And it is these characteristics that allow us to see the stages as belonging to the same process. Now, a possible choice of stages is the following, and I'll share my screen with you here. And here, share, and I'll put this into, slideshow. There we go. Now, where each stage consists of two phases, a growth phase and an interaction phase. Leaving out the first stage, which started with the Big Bang and which is still under considerable discussion. Then in the growth phase of each of these stages, the number of entities and thus the density of entities increased, and with it, the probability or strength of the interaction between the entities, until in the interaction phase, the interaction was strong enough to form new entities. Elementary particles combine to form atoms. Atoms combine to form molecules. Molecules combine to form cells. Cells combine to form organisms. Organisms combine to form animals, of which we are particularly interested in humans. And humans combine to form societies. If we don't look too closely and generalize the concept of energy to include activities, it is possible to see that in each stage, this two-phase process was one of converting free energy into bound energy, with the latter being the binding energy that formed the new entities, and that the complexity of the entities increased from stage to stage. And if we think of the ratio of free energy to total energy as temperature, as we know it, for example, in a gas, then we can see that the temperature decreased from stage to stage. Now, I'm sure it will have occurred to many of you that there is a big step in the nature of the entities taking place in stage 4, and that is the appearance of life. The entities go from being passive to being active. They embody processes and need to interact with their environment to stay alive. And of course, the process of evolution is now quite different. It is no longer by interaction and combination. It is, of course, not the case that a lung, a heart, a kidney, etc., collide in space and form an animal. The process is one of sexual reproduction, subject to mutations. But the outcome of the process can still be usefully described in terms of complexity and bound energy. And a further step taking place at this point is, of course, that our horizon is now limited to planet Earth. With life comes its inevitable companion, death. And in between, the existence of the entities, now called species, is characterized by a further common characteristic, survival. As both the species and their interactions with the environment increased in complexity, so did the ability to survive and to detect and assess threats and take adaptive action. A single cell in a liquid environment can detect the presence of a harmful substance and move in the direction of decreasing concentration. An ant can detect a moving object, such as a finger, as a threat and move away from it. An animal can detect physical danger through processing various sensory signals and take appropriate action. Human can also detect physical danger, but in addition, can identify ideas that threaten society. Because now survival is more than just the survival of the individual, it is also the survival of society. The knowledge that guides the long-term direction is embedded in our brains. It is a feature of our brains, just as we have 2 arms and 2 legs. And as such, it must be present in our DNA. It evolved in parallel with the evolution of the physical complexity and capability of organisms. And where it failed to keep up with the latter, the resulting species was doomed to extinction. This raises an interesting question that was posed recently in the book by Professor George Paxinos, with the title A River Divided, where he asks, is our brain the right size? And he is, of course, a specialist on brains. The right size, that is, to handle the problems facing society. For his answer, you should read the book. I will try to show you that it is simply the wrong question in the context of society. But to pursue this idea further, let us now focus on our main interest, the evolution of human society. That is on stage 7, the last stage, and then narrow that focus even further by considering only the last 10,000 years or so. The justification for this limit will become evident shortly. There are several ways of describing the evolution of society and to structure this evolution into a sequence of stages. One such structure is the following. As the interaction between individuals increased, they formed families. Families interacted to form clans. Clans formed fiefdoms. Fiefdoms formed kingdoms. And kingdoms formed the current nation states. And we can think of these as the species of the genus society. Each new species presented a new environment for the individual, and to be successful, the individual had to adapt to the demands of the stronger and more complex interactions. This included changed behavior and such new concepts as compassion and solidarity. And a very interesting question, but one that we cannot pursue in this talk, is whether this social behavior is something the newborn child must learn in each generation, or whether some of this acquired behavior becomes a heritable trait through the process of epigenetics. That is, epigenetics would be to the evolution of society what genetics is to the evolution of organisms. Be that as it may, you can now see that the significant evolution of society took place within the last 10,000 years or so, allowing us to limit our attention to that time span. We also note that, contrary to the evolution of organisms, where the least of fit species disappeared, in this social evolution, the lower species did not disappear. They just modified their nature and formed the structure of the new species. For example, the family is still an important structural element of a nation. As a result of this structuring, the interactions between the individuals became more complex. But the individuals still had something in common, a belief in some common objective. And this belief was represented in the form of a common infrastructure. For example, if the common belief was that of a threatening environment, the objective became defense against this threat, and the common infrastructure could be a wall around the community, such as a town wall. Of course, the formation of any society meant a certain restriction on individual freedom. And this restriction was propagated through the structure as the society evolved. For example, when Australian states became parts of the Australian nation, they had to give up some of their freedom of action. The pain of this sacrifice of freedom has to be more than compensated for by the advantages the enlarged society brings. And a large part of this advantage is in the competition with other societies, in the social version of survival of the fittest. But in the last stage in the sequence, the current stage, where the nations should form a world society, this motivation is absent. There is no other world to compete with or to defend ourselves against, unless you are a Star Wars tragic. You might say, well, we don't have a common competitor or enemy, but instead we have common problems, such as global warming, pandemics, and large-scale migration. Yes, they are common, but they are not seen as common by individual countries. Each country thinks it might get by with contributing less and profiting more than the rest. Before going to the second idea, let me just illustrate the concept of the common infrastructure by the following diagram. As a society evolves and its complexity and structure increases, issues and problems appear that must be solved, and the rate at which these problems appear is increasing with the rate of evolution, driven mainly by technology. That is the curve A. The rate at which they are actually solved and represented by changes and additions to the common infrastructure is the curve B. And what this demonstrates is that if the rate of problem solving is inadequate, even though the time taken to solve a given number of problems, parameter delta, is decreasing, the number of outstanding problems, epsilon, will continue to increase. And what you see here is a picture of a society heading for collapse. Now, to the second idea. It arises from the realization that our actions are determined by the information available to us at the time of action. That is, both information stored in our memory and the information provided by our senses at the time of action. Hence, we can, in principle, describe society and its evolution in terms of information, where I take information here to include beliefs, knowledge, impressions, signs, data, etc. The interaction between individuals can then also be described in terms of information, so that the individual appears as an information processing element. Most of the information we receive and process relates to our daily lives, to our family life, to work and professional life, to hobbies and sport, and so on. It is in the form of facts, and we acquire them by learning. Only a very small portion of the information we receive relates to our beliefs, to what we care about and are willing to make a sacrifice for. The information that defines the common objective we noted earlier. We acquire it through discourse and persuasion, and it is this type of information that drives the evolution of society. When we now go to the third idea, it is with the understanding that we focus exclusively on this type of information. The third idea comes from the system concept and the top-down approach. When we are confronted with an object that is complex, it appears as a mass of information about many different elements and different interactions between them, as illustrated by the outer boundary on the left. We can reduce the complexity in a stepwise process by deleting details of the description until we are left with what we might call the essence of the object. This is the process of abstraction. Of course, as we do this, the object described looks less and less like reality, but the essence remains throughout every step. This essence can then be used to reverse the process and increase the level of detail step by step, bringing a structure into the mass of information, as shown on the right. and so, in our case, increase our understanding of society and its evolution. In our present view of society, the top level of abstraction, the essence, is that society is an information processing system. And in the first level of increasing detail, it is described in terms of two entities: a set of identical information processing individuals and a set of identical interaction channels operating through the exchange of information. In this figure, the interaction between individuals is shown as each individual interacting with what I call the circulating information. The information produced by all the other individuals and that we access through the mass media, through face-to-face interactions, and through the various social media. In addition, each individual can obtain information by accessing society's collective memory, as in libraries and the multitude of databases available through the internet. Each individual can also generate new information by observation of its environment, discovery, and by internal processing of information, that is, by reflection and analysis. The operation of this information processing system is society's collective intelligence. And that brings me back to the earlier question about the size of the brain. Society's problems are not solved by single brains, but by brains interacting, forming a multiprocessor computing system that outperforms a single brain by an amount that depends on the effectiveness of the interaction. That is, on the operating conditions of the collective intelligence. As the operation takes place in the physical domain, it is subject to a number of operating conditions, including that all circulating information is freely available, that all individuals have the means to access the information, that they have adequate time for the operation, and so on. Let us for a moment assume that all these conditions are optimally fulfilled. I then assert that the direction of the evolution of society, determined by the collective intelligence, is the one with the greatest probability of survival. My justification for this assertion is threefold. Firstly, observing the evolution of organisms, the ability to sense danger and to take adaptive action developed as the complexity of the organisms developed, as we noted earlier. But in addition to being able to sense and avoid physical threats, we have embedded information that allows us to identify ideas that threaten society. Because now survival is more than just the survival of the individual, it is also the survival of society. In this sense, the collective intelligence is more than just a consensus-building process. It can be considered to be society's immune system, preventing society from going off in a destructive direction. The ability to survive evolved just as our other features evolved, in particular, speech and language, and with them, the ability to communicate. And what needed to survive also evolved, from the individual to its offspring to the groups and to finally, in humans, the survival of society. This understanding is part of our nature, just as much as our physical features. The presence of this basic embedded knowledge was surmised long ago and by various people. Well-known examples include the Chinese philosopher Mengzi, who called it sprouts, and Charles Darwin, who called it instincts. And more recently, it was taken up by the Australian philosopher Lyndon Story in the form of human potential. In short, the embedded knowledge includes the knowledge that humanity's future is as a society. The second support for my assertion is that unless we believe in a supernatural entity or force, like a god or a cosmic force of some sort, there simply is nothing but us, humanity, that can determine our future. And thirdly, the collective intelligence as the process for guiding the evolution of society arises as the only process that can adjudicate between the different levels of our embedded instincts, from survival of the individual to survival of society. A single person can only decide what is best for him or her. And indeed, the process to include an increasing proportion of society in the decision-making process is documented by history. So, this is the very simple or abstract view I have of society as an information processing system consisting of all its members as the processors and the interaction between them. And as the human being has not changed significantly in the last 10,000 years, it follows that the pace of the evolution of society is determined by this interaction. I have developed this view in much further detail, supported by a model of the information processing capability of the individual and a more detailed description of the information exchange, and by taking account of the fact that society is not unstructured, leading to inequalities and tensions. However, the central idea from which all further detail flows is the importance of the quality of the interaction, of the public information and discourse, its truth, completeness, significant accessibility, and verifiability. And conversely, the greatest danger facing us today is the increasing manipulation of the public information flow in the form of polarization, trivialization, and advertising. We are so concerned with our physical well-being, with our health, and with the quality of our food, water, and air. But why are we not equally concerned with the quality of the information we receive? The operating conditions of the collective intelligence are currently very far from their ideal values. And so the direction of evolution is likely to be far from that of the greatest probability of survival. Before I finish, I would like to make one further point. In the view of society I just presented, the interacting individuals are simply assumed to exist. In reality, there is a constant process going on to maintain this mass of individuals. Each individual goes through a life cycle of birth, growing up, then the adult life as a contributor to the collective intelligence, and then death. This can be compared with our bodies, where thousands of cells die and are replaced every day, supported by the metabolic process converting food into the energy and substances required for existence. Society has a similar metabolic process. But in addition to the physical process of maintaining and replacing bodies, it contains a process of transmitting information from one generation to the next. That is, education can be seen as the other part of society's metabolic process. And both parts are essential to the individual's ability to contribute to society. And some of that contribution should be to the evolution of society, to determine in which direction that evolution should proceed. This raises two questions. Firstly, Unless we know in which direction we want to evolve, how can we determine what we should teach? And secondly, even to the extent that we know the direction, are we really providing the required information? I see a great deal of discussion and emphasis on the importance of STEM subjects. And as an engineer, I can appreciate that. But I see very little emphasis on the subjects that develop an understanding of society and what drives its evolution. In the list of subjects offered to years 11 and 12 students in New South Wales, I see only two that are relevant to this objective: modern history and society and culture. From the descriptions, they appear both very good, but the problem is that only 15% of students take modern history and only 2% take society and culture. So perhaps we should rethink our priorities when it comes to the purpose of education. So thank you. And now I think Roger will handle questions.
Thank you so much, Erik. We have 20 minutes or more for questions. I think Ola has a question. Ola, would you like to talk to Erik? No? Okay, the question is, how does your theory explain the sources of contradictions which are inherent in any society? Furthermore, do you think these contradictions rather often grow into animosities and even wars? You should be able to see that, Erik, in the chat.
Well, okay, you read it out very clearly. Okay. So for the sources of contradiction, I think really basically comes down to the perversion of the information flow, that our information flow is highly influenced by special interests, and it's not really a pure set of facts, factual information. And that's how a lot of contradictions, it's simply that people have different information. We don't have an agreed set of information. So that's where I think you can see that everywhere, just here in Australia, for instance. I don't know how it's like in Ukraine, but here in Australia, the information we get is extremely biased and one-sided. And how that can lead to animosity, well, that's quite clear. And people want to believe in what they believe that has developed through the information they have. And it is a, shall we say, a characteristic of people that they don't like people with a different view, because really it's a matter of insecurity. If you believe something, then if somebody else believes something else, it's a little question if your belief could actually be right. So we don't want to have that. So there's a lot of animosity that arises from simply differences in opinion and in particular in beliefs. Are you muted, Roger? Roger, woo, woo, woo.
Sorry, Erik, I thought that I did unmute. Ola says, thank you very much. She doesn't have a microphone on her computer, so I'm sorry about that. Okay. Any other questions?
I must have explained things extremely well.
Erik? Alistair, yes.
Yeah, could I just come in and apologise for any misunderstandings which come through in terms of what I'm going to say? I mean, I found that fascinating an intriguing contribution to the, if you like, the development of the sort of grand theory that we don't see or hear very much about these days. And as you were talking, I was sort of flitting back and forwards between the idea of the information and its distortion by various interests, and in terms of the way that it's utilized, and particularly by your last comments about the sources of contradiction and animosity basically being about the disruption in the flow of information and its accuracy and what have you. But I was just wondering how the idea of self-interest comes into this, and whether or not are you assuming a malleable human nature in what you're discussing. At one point, I thought, I've written down, ultimately you're pessimistic about the future. And yet, on the other hand, you seem to be positing a potentially optimistic view of the future, in the sense that if we can fix, for example, education, then we can start to overcome. Because I felt that the crux of what you were saying fell into, I think it was the third of your slides, where you talked about if the rate at which problem solving fell below the rate at which new problems arose, then we had a very negative future outcome. And I was just trying to get that sort of sense of where do you see human nature as lying in this, and how does that cash out in terms of self-interested behavior or other reflecting behavior? I hope that was clearish.
Yeah, no, that was clear. And I mean, I'm not an expert on human behavior, I have to say, but the way I look at it is that we have some basic, call them instincts or whatever, and some of them are for preserving ourselves. That's a very, shall we say, basic instinct. But then we also have instincts. We somehow find that the species is important, that parents will give their lives for their children. So obviously it's not only self-interest there. There's something more. And once we get to the stage where we are now, somehow we do realize that society, we can't exist without it. But the other interests still remain, the self-interest remains. And the more local interest to the family and so on still remains. But there is this, and that's what I'm not sure where that comes from, if that is developed, if we can inherit that, or if it's just simply that children that grow up in today's society, they get this understanding that society is important. I don't know that, but it's an interesting question. And I mean, the self-interest, we have to also realize something that I haven't discussed here, but that is, you said, being pessimistic about the future. Well, I'm not really all that pessimistic, but I can see some big problems, and I can see we could have some big hiccups on the way. We've had a couple of world wars. I think we could have some much worse ones. And the reason is, I mean, one reason is clearly that there's a great inequality in the world. And this inequality leads to tension. And above all, it is simply that the Western world, through 500 years of raping and pillaging the rest of the world, have come up with a standard of living that is at least 4 times that of the rest. There's a tremendous tension, and we want to hold on to it by all means. And I think this is a really dangerous issue, and it's led, of course, by the nation that leads the West, that's the US, and is determined to hold on to this by all means. But I think maybe, there are also signs of people realizing this. It's not my idea. Other people have the same idea also and see that this is a danger and that something has to be done about it. So, it's a reflection of self-interest on a, shall we say, national or a greater basis. That's how I see that. I don't know if that answered your question, or maybe not.
I think it was more of a discursive thing, and I think the other element to it might be the extent to which the time frames that we're talking about, because one could look at you talked about a couple of hiccups in the process, and then referred to 2 world wars, and in the process in the aftermath of the second, there was the building of the great blocks, which seemed to fall in between the national stage and the global stage, and the potential collapse of those and their reinstatement. And then you get down to sort of little local difficulties like Brexit, which in the one form is stupidity personified, but on the other hand is going to have fairly long-term implications, and why those sorts of things should come out. So I think again, it's maybe the grand scale which is raises particular issues that might lead to that sort of discussion.
Well, I see. One thing is, if you look at the picture I sort of gave you of evolution, the thing is at each step there has to be what I call a common infrastructure. That is, whatever the belief is, has to be represented by a physical infrastructure. Like in a nation, we have a government and we have the law, the judiciary system and all that. Because we believe in justice, we have a judiciary system. Now, on a world scale, we don't have anything like that, because it requires that you give up some of your independence, of your sovereignty. That's been the case everywhere. In the family members have to give up a little bit of their sovereignty to work together. And it's the same in the nation. You can't do what you like. You have to give up some of your sovereignty. And that is the understanding of that, and that must be the next step if we're going to step into a world society, is that you have to understand that there has to be a giving up of sovereignty. Now, we could start maybe by not making a grand scale of it, but take some of those problems I mentioned. Pandemics, there would be a good argument for the nations giving up their sovereignty in handling pandemics and centralize that and give that authority to actually run it, and nations couldn't object to it, couldn't change it. That central authority would do what it thinks is best for the world to handle a pandemic. So that would be an example of where we could maybe start with a small thing. Global warming is another one. We could agree to create a world authority, a world environmental authority, and that would have this authority, and the states give up their sovereignty in handling matters like that. It's more difficult because of the economic implications, but still, it might be an approach, because to make a world management authority or a world that I think in one step is utopian. Yeah.
Thanks, Alistair, and thank for your question and comments. Keith Noble now has a question. Thanks. Keith.
Good day, Erik. Thanks very much for your presentation. I always particularly enjoy thinking that crosses boundaries between disciplines, because it's always fertile ground for new ideas to emerge. But as I listened to you, I was reminded of Yuval Harari's book, Homo Deus, where he predicts the future evolution of mankind. And he says, historically, we've become algorithm processing machines. And as we do that better and better, our capacity will be enhanced by artificial intelligence. And that is our future. And it's a pretty scary sort of future in some ways from an individual perspective. But I just wondered if, as an engineer, if you read that and had some thoughts about how it relates to your ideas.
Well, I have to say I haven't read that book, but I should look into it. But when you say like algorithm, you see, I think that's maybe important for many things, but the main thing is the interaction between people, not the ability of the human brain to be augmented by artificial intelligence. It really comes down to this averaging process, which is the sort of the shall we say, that avoids problems or big mistakes. Because if we can get this averaging to work, then I think we're way ahead there. And algorithms there, I think it's not about individual brains solving problems in physics or in sociology or in whatever. I see the big problem is to get the collective intelligence to work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Now, Andrew Jacobowitz, would you like to talk to your comments or just leave them there for...
Maybe just leave them there. I don't want to try and repeat them, but I don't know if Erik wants to make a response.
Erik, it's quite a lengthy comment there, so you should be able to read that in the comments section.
In the chat?
Chat section.
Yeah.
One question I might ask you, if that's okay, Erik, how do you see, say, the concept of human agency fitting in to your fairly abstract model? Like you were talking about information and communication. Like, for example, we had a situation in relation to communication just recently where, well, let's say all of the mainstream media were incredibly pro-conservative, and yet with the particular government that they were supporting was thrown out in no uncertain terms. So where does a theory of human agency, which has been so important in sociology in the last generation, I guess, how does that fit into your model?
Well, I think human agency is at the bottom of it. It's just that it's being more or less influenced by the media and things like that. Human agency is a characteristic of the human. And I think if you want to take the example of the recent election, it was clear that people simply disliked what they were seeing without going into any great economic theory or anything. They simply disliked being lied to and taken for fools, and they simply reacted to that. So, and humans are very capable of doing that. And human agency, this is another, of course, the part that I left out in my talk, where I couldn't spend more time on it, but I talked about the collective intelligence, so that you collectively work out in which direction you want to go. But you have to go. You still have to do it. I mean, it's not, information is not enough. You have to turn the information, your beliefs, into actual action. And of course, there in between is at least two steps. It's the political system that turns the ideas into legislation, into actionable requests. And then there is the government that actually carries it out. And there is also a big issue that this process, it takes quite a while for the feedback, so people see that this is not what they wanted. And I think slowly people do react to that. I think, for instance, an obvious case in Australia is the indefinite detention and the treatment of refugees. Whenever there is a survey done, like 70% are against it, but the government still went on and went in another direction. Well, I think that's an example of where people felt we don't like it, and we're going to, therefore, in the election, which is the only thing that's open to us, we're going to vote against them. So there is a case where the collective intelligence, if you like, people did not subscribe to this, even though there was a lot of the conservative press promoted it. So anyway. Yep.
Okay, thanks. Alistair's made another comment. Alistair, would you like to talk to that, or just leave it there?
I'm happy enough to leave it there, or to get a response from Erik or anyone else, just about the potential dangers of a global system, and how do we control it? How do we overcome the potential for a central captured control mechanism? I mean, if people are getting upset about national governments, they're telling them what to do. They're going to get really upset about a global government. And then there is that, as you said, that whole issue about how does that feedback mechanism operate? Is it a form of democracy, or is there something else going on here?
Well, look, Alistair, I mean, that is a really $64,000 question. I mean, that's a really difficult issue. I mean, it's difficult, as you say, already at the national level. How do you actually ensure, even if you can get people to agree what they want, can you ensure that that's what happens? And well, I don't actually have a really good answer to that. I see on the national level, I have a good answer, which I've worked out in some detail. And that is, I think our political system is completely wrong. And I think it's a stupid system. I mean, here you have one half of the government and the politicians working as hard as they can to disrupt what the others are doing so that they can win the next election. I mean, they should work together, all work together. And there is an example of that in the world. That's in Switzerland. The Swiss, they have their elections, and they have, according to what the party, how well it does, it gets a number of ministers. And these ministers from all different parties then form the government and have to work together. There's not one party, no. It's proportional to what the people elected. That's a much better system. And that's why Switzerland also manages well. When you think 4 languages, you think it will fall apart, but it doesn't. And I think the system we have in the so-called the multi-party system is absolute. I think it's a really bad system. And aside from the fact that you can buy it, what you get is the best government money can buy. I mean, it's pretty bad.
Okay, thanks, Alistair. And thank you, everybody. We're sort of getting towards the hour mark. So unless there are any other issues or questions, I might...
Now, Roger, can I ask you one thing?
Yes.
All these questions that came on the chat, which I haven't really had time to look at now.
I can save them. That's fine. I can
You
say
can save them.
yeah.
And
We have
send
one
them.
more question. We have one
Oh.
more question. Well, Carla would like to, go.
Oh, thanks, Erik, for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. Hello to everyone else as well. I just had I guess, an education question. I'm thinking particularly of the subjects that you're talking about in Year 12, and only because I guess I'm been in education a long time, and I know critical literacies flow through primary schools and secondary, as well as media and politics. But I guess my question to you is, what were you envisaging, or what were you thinking would be the best way to go in education? Did you have an idea of what particular subjects or skills that you'd want in those upper year levels?
Well, yes. I think, first of all, I think the course of modern history, which I think is not bad, I looked at it, but that to have a relatively truthful knowledge of how we got to where we are is important. So that's one thing that should be included, and should be obligatory, and more, just as important as mathematics. And then a subject about society, what, the understanding of society, what is it? We have courses that teach us about the economics of industrial enterprises and so on. But what about society? A course that actually takes into account, that explains the processes that make a society work. I don't see anything. Well, the society and culture has a little bit of it, but it could have more. And that, I think, is important. And I think also important, and I have to say, I don't know to what extent this is being done, but throughout all of education, starting in primary school, and I can see when I went to school, the focus is on the individual, that you have to do well, beat your competitors, be the best in the class. It should be much more on teamwork. You can't succeed if the class doesn't succeed. There should be a change towards this feeling of society and your relationship to the other people. So I think this focus on the individual, and I mean, it's quite extreme in some cases, what people will do to get ahead and beat the others and cheat and whatever. It's just simply a mentality that I'm important, I must get ahead, and that's not what education should emphasize. I think it's of course, just like in a society, if everybody doesn't do their work and try to do a good job, society won't work. But it can't be just about the individual. And therefore, I think throughout all of education, that can be emphasized. Yeah.
Thanks, Erik.
Thanks, Carla, and sorry for missing you there. And thank you, Erik. So I think at that point, we might call this webinar to a close. On behalf of TASA, I would like to thank Erik for agreeing to present today. And I think it was a most interesting webinar. And thank you very much, all the participants, and good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you.